My name is Alyssa Gray. I've been a litigator and now I'm a professor at a Jewish seminary. What that means is I consider late work to be a federal crime, and when I give a grade, there is no appeal. But enough about me. We Jews have always been book-bearing boundary crossers. Throughout our history, as we've moved from place to place, not always voluntarily, we've carried on our backs a vast library consisting of many wings and many, many, many books. I'd like to speak to you tonight about one particular shelf in the Jewish law wing, the shelf of Jewish legal codes, systematic presentations of Jewish law. And I'd like to focus on one, the Arba'at Turim, or 4 rows, a 4-part code written by a scholar named Rabbi Jacob ben Asher, who fled his native Germany in 1303, settling in Toledo in what is now Spain in 1305. Why the Arba'at Turim? Well, Rabbi Jacob speaks to me. He crossed intellectual and geographical boundaries, as I have. His own voice comes through very strongly in the code. At times, he gives us touching, personal, biographical details. He wrote in both a literary and a legal register, and his legal writing is rich with human details. Tonight, we're going to break, or maybe just gently bend, the rules of a law library. We are not going to speak on cell phones, which is never okay, nor are we going to eat, which is also never okay, although maybe understandable during finals time. We're going to engage in some creative blurring of genre boundaries. We're going to read a portion of Rabbi Jacob's code as literature. We're going to look to the code for answers, not the sort of answers one typically expects to find in a Jewish code, answers about Shabbat and Kashrut, maybe about how to conduct a wedding or how to compensate you if I back my SUV over your brand new bike. We're going to look to the code for answers to some of life's biggest questions. We're going to bring to the reading of the code some of the very questions we bring to the reading of literature. Now, I do have a confession to make. I did at times snack in the legal library when it wasn't finals time, but I did make it through, and from my subsequent legal career, I do recall a thing or two about codes. For example, here's the U.S. Code, the published set of statutes passed by Congress and signed into law by the President. If you'd like a state example, have a look, feast your eyes on McKinney's Laws of New York. In this case, the statutes are passed by the New York State Legislature and signed into law by the governor, and of course, there are 49 other state codes besides. I realized very early on, and I'm hardly the first or the only person to realize this, the Jewish codes I study differ from these secular American codes. In fact, to some extent, calling these Jewish legal works codes is a bit of a misnomer. Each of the Jewish codes was produced by one scholar, in the privacy of his study, as it were. Not one of them was passed by any sort of legislative body or affirmed by any sort of chief executive. Well then, if the Arba'at Turim is not strictly speaking a code, what is it? If we take a broad view, we can think of the Arba'at Turim as a monumental work of interpretation, dare I say it, a literature of interpretation. Rabbi Jacob produced the Arba'at Turim as his response to other post-Talmudic Jewish legal literature. What Rabbi Jacob gives us in the Arba'at Turim is a systematic presentation of his readings and interpretations of Talmud and post-Talmudic Jewish legal literature in order to give us his vision of a life of Jewish practice, how to conduct a prayer service, what blessings to make over food, how to give charity, how to relate to our workers, and big ideas such as what is justice. What Rabbi Jacob did in the Arba'at Turim is essentially not much different from what any other writer does in producing any other type of writing, whether legal or otherwise. He responded to texts through the creation of other texts. Although I am certainly no one's idea of a Rabbi Jacob, that's what I did in my previous career as a litigator in preparing legal memoranda and briefs. It's what I do now in my career as an academic, whether writing scholarly or popular works. I respond to texts through the creation of other texts. If you'd like an example with greater cultural heft than me, and I can hardly blame you, think about the great writers of the classical or the now expanded Western canon. Think about Plato writing his dialogues, or Dante his Divine Comedy, or Shakespeare his plays, or any other writer that you can think of. Each of these great writers produced his and now her texts in response to other texts, whether these other texts were literary texts or the texts of their own lives. Let's think about the Arba'at Turim in relation to a more formal definition of literature. I bring you dictionary.com, according to which literature is writings in which expression and form, in connection with ideas of permanent and universal interest, that's a very important phrase, are characteristic or essential features, as poetry, novels, history, biography, and essays. Let's not view this definition as a straitjacket, but as an opportunity for some creative blurring of genre boundaries. We Jews have always done some of our most innovative thinking about ideas of permanent and universal interest through the medium of law. Jewish legal literature itself complicates genre boundaries. Law and non-law, halakha and agadah coexist throughout most of Jewish legal literature. When we read Jewish legal literature as literature, therefore, we're not really reading it as much against the grain as some might think. Jewish law is already, in some sense, literature. What have I learned from Rabbi Jacob about justice, that great idea of permanent and universal interest? Well, like everyone else in this auditorium and those watching online, I get outraged when I see instances of injustice, which tragically, of course, can take many forms. Injustice can appear to be monumental and overwhelming, like human trafficking, or like the case of Bernard Madoff, a scammer who masqueraded as a legitimate businessman. There are also cases that we could think of as cases of Madoff wannabes, people who misuse the phone or the internet to take advantage of the vulnerable, particularly vulnerable elderly people. Even the courtroom can be a site of injustice. Scarcely a month goes by that we don't hear about someone released from prison who never should have been there to begin with. Or we see juries acquit defendants in circumstances that leave even the judges in those cases scratching their heads in disbelief. When we hear about things like this, naturally we ask ourselves, where is justice? For that matter, what is justice? Isn't that the sort of question we bring to the reading of literature? In Chapter 1 of Part 4 of his Code, Rabbi Jacob skillfully weaves together biblical and Talmudic materials to give us his vision of what justice is. To him, justice is compelling evildoers to disgorge, to give back their ill-gotten gains. To him, justice is judges intervening to protect the vulnerable from those who would prey upon them. To Rabbi Jacob, as he expresses it in his text, the work of justice is dynamic. It's never finished. His text contemplates a world of realism about the possibility and reality of human evil, but also idealism about judges' ability to stamp that evil out. That's the first part of Chapter 1. As Rabbi Jacob moves along, Chapter 1 transitions into a technical legal discussion of jurisdiction, the types of cases that Jewish judges may and may not take in the diaspora. This seems like a bit of a letdown. The chapter begins with soaring rhetoric on justice and then transitions into a technical legal discussion of jurisdiction. But Rabbi Jacob wonderfully weaves together the two parts of that chapter. When writing about two broad categories of cases, marriage contracts, inheritances, and gifts on the one hand, and violent robberies on the other, Rabbi Jacob uses language that reminds us of the soaring rhetoric of justice from the first part of the chapter. The types of parties affected by these cases are by and large vulnerable people: widows, divorcees, orphans, and victims of violent robberies. And as to these types of cases, Rabbi Jacob is adamant that judges must take these cases because, as he says in the Hebrew, it is kedei lin'ol delet bifnei osei avla, in order to lock the door in the face of one who would do unrighteousness. Osei avla, doer of unrighteousness, a phrase that has biblical overtones. And he goes on to explain what he means by this, and now I'm really paraphrasing, because if a potential scammer gets the sense that no judge will take his case, that he won't be punished, he'll say to himself, what have I got to lose? Of course I'm going to take advantage of this widow, this orphan, this other vulnerable person. In order to make sure this doesn't happen, Rabbi Jacob is adamant that judges must take these sorts of cases. Now, all the legal details about jurisdiction that Rabbi Jacob sets out are significant. I'm a lawyer. You'll get no argument from me that there's ever such a thing as an irrelevant or uninteresting legal detail. But we're looking at the big picture. We're looking for the ideas of permanent and universal interest that we can glean from these details. And in this case, Rabbi Jacob is very consistent, whether writing in the literary register of the first part of the chapter or in the legal register of the latter part of the chapter. He is consistent that justice means rescuing the vulnerable from those who would prey upon them. What have I learned from Rabbi Jacob? Well, I've learned not to be discouraged by the cable TV crime shows. I've learned that those of us who are outraged by injustice are not the crazy ones. It is the osei avla, the doers of unrighteousness, who are the ones who are really out of sync with the way the world is supposed to work. Now, Jewish law is much too important to be left only to the legal scholars. Please do not take that observation with you outside of this room tonight, please. By the way, if you're interested in Rabbi Jacob's essay on justice, it was translated in volume 6 of the Jewish Law Annual. If you have some Hebrew ability, grab a friend, grab a dictionary, all wonderful things to have, and get started. Enrich your own passion for justice with Rabbi Jacob's words. If you're interested in beginning to read Jewish law as literature, but the barely translated Arba'at Turim seems a bit daunting, no worries. Start with Maimonides, the great jurist and literary artist whose work, the Mishnah Torah, has been translated multiple times. Rabbi Jacob will catch you later. Maimonides is a great start. Remember, Jewish legal literature is certainly more than lists of rules. It's even more than a series of wonderfully articulated visions of a life of Jewish practice. Even for Jews who are uninterested in the details of a life of Jewish practice, Jewish legal literature can be a fantastic resource for reflecting deeply on some of the big issues that concern us all. What is a human life? What does it mean to be a Jew? What is justice? What makes for a good society? Push the boundaries of the classical or the now expanded Western canon by pushing the boundaries of your own Jewish literacy. Read Jewish law as literature. Make this literature part of the texts of your own lives. Be countercultural. Be bold. Be a boundary crosser. Thank you.
Thanks for watching Eli Talks. Click through or subscribe to the Eli Talks channel for more inspired Jewish ideas.